Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. When World War I soldiers lied injured on the battlefield and a combat medic would come to them, maybe tie up a tourniquet, and then give them pain relief, did they give them ecstasy? Okay, you might be thinking that's a weird way to start out an episode. But what I'm doing is presenting a question that a listener posed to me, and then I'm going to explain how I'm going to unpack it in this episode. That exact question came from listener Daniel Motamedi. And what I'm going to be doing in this episode is not merely just answering yes or no or what was in the medical bag of a combat medic in World War I, but exploring the broader history of combat medics throughout history. This was something that I just took for granted always existed. And this is something that I was ignorant on until very recently. Let me explain why. There's been a few places in the media where combat medics have been given some attention. A few years ago, there was that Andrew Garfield movie, Hacksaw Ridge, about a combat medic who was also a conscientious objector against using a firearm in World War II, and was one of the only conscientious objectors like that to win the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was a combat medic in the Pacific Theater, and it seemed that his job was to run around, find a soldier who had been shot or wounded on the battlefield who yelled out, "Medic!" was lying there injured. He would run up to them, maybe tie up a tourniquet, give him a shot of morphine, and drag him to safety. In the HBO miniseries Band of Brothers that follows the paratroopers out of the 101st Airborne Easy Company through the European theater in World War II, one episode also focuses on a combat medic. I never really thought about the role of a combat medic, and because I didn't think about it, I think I just assumed that they were always there. But when I did a series about the military history of the Civil War and the Revolutionary War with co-host James Early, James got into what it was like to be injured in the Civil War. You could be lying on the battlefield for days waiting for help. There was no guarantee that someone came to you. If you were lucky, some of your comrades would drag you off, or you could pull yourself off the battlefield. But you could lie there for days in agony, rain would come, infection would set in, and it was absolute misery. I found out as I dug in more that that was the norm throughout history, that there wasn't any organized way to get people off the battlefield after they were injured. So what I'm going to be doing in this episode is talk about that evolution, what it looked like to treat a wounded person on the battlefield, what sort of medicine they actually got, especially World War I, if it was ecstasy or if it was some other type of pain reliever, and what does that say about society at large? Very briefly, I just want to give a few bullet points about how combat medicine evolves over the centuries and then get more deeply into it. Well, like I said, combat medicine was an ad hoc affair until very recently. To give you an idea of why that is, it's not that people disregarded their wounded, it was that you had to fight light if you wanted to move quickly until mechanized warfare comes along in the 20th century. Take Alexander the Great's army. Alexander the Great's army was one of the most lightly supplied, nimble militaries in the ancient world. And that's one of the main reasons that it was able to achieve all of its successes, because it had such a light supply chain. In the ancient medieval world, armies would lumber along because the number of support people and camp followers would oftentimes be as large as the number of actual fighting soldiers. This is because armies traveled with huge numbers of carts and pack animals to carry their equipment and provisions, and with rickety carts going along on poorly paved roads, you can't travel very quickly. But the Macedonian army didn't use these types of carts. Soldiers would be trained to carry their own equipment and provisions. This allowed the troops to travel very quickly, and sometimes they could reach enemies before the enemy had any word that they were coming. But with such light supplies, you're not going to have a lot of provisions for injured soldiers. You're not going to be able to set up anything so you can have camps and ancient equivalents to infirmaries for injured soldiers. Now, there was treatment for injured soldiers since time immemorial. During Alexander the Great's campaigns in the 4th century BC, if you had a bleeding extremity wound, being slashed by a sword or hit by an arrow, you would be taken care of through tourniquets. Tourniquets were also used by Romans during amputations. Now, if you're injured on the battlefield, you would be dragged off, which could be very painful, if not deadly. So this leads to the development of stretchers that were first made of wickers and placed on frames, The earliest recording we have of this goes to 1380, so this is late medieval period times we're talking about here. Simple stretchers are also used to transport casualties during wartime throughout the mid-20th century. Really, until the Civil War, it used to be that if a soldier was injured, he would lay on the battlefield where he had fallen without hope of being rescued. This change was someone that we're going to come back to and look at in great detail in this episode, Dr. Jonathan Letterman, who in 1862 revamped what to do with injured soldiers through the development of the Army Medical Corps. He trained men to operate horse and wagon teams to pick up wounded soldiers and bring them back to the field dressing station for treatment. And he also developed a 3-tiered evacuation system, which is still used today. The first was the field dressing station, located next to the battlefield. Then was the field hospital, known as the MASH units, and finally the large hospital for patients requiring prolonged treatment. What really expanded the role of the combat medic was World War I. With entrenched warfare, machine guns, the appearance of tanks, nerve gas, and everything else that expanded the number of those injured by orders of magnitude, millions of casualties had to be tended to, but the war couldn't stop to treat the wounded. This isn't like the Odyssey or the Iliad, where in the evening people come out to claim their dead. Medics had to rush with the troops to find the wounded, stop their bleeding, and bring the soldiers to an aid station. And there were all sorts of things that medics had to learn as they're being integrated into wide-scale modern warfare. They have to learn how to protect themselves in the battlefield for themselves or their patients. Well, the survival rate grows over the decades as the science of combat medicine grows. World War II had an 85% survival rate for a wounded soldier if they were treated within the first hour, which is 3 times higher than World War I. In the Vietnam War, medics were now able to evacuate soldiers with helicopters. The rate of survival grew to 98% for soldiers who were evacuated within the first hour. And there's all sorts of emblems that combat medics wore, like crosses on their helmets, to make it clear that they weren't combat soldiers. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Now, let's go way back and look at how combat medicine was looked at in history. And I mentioned Homeric epics, the Odyssey and the Iliad. And sadly, when we're looking into the Bronze Age, we don't have many firsthand sources. So historians will use something like Homeric epics to be able to glean out some historical facts of what is going on. Some historians have even looked at the Iliad and broken down the data of how many soldiers were injured and by what means to get a sense of what an ancient battlefield will look like. According to one survey, arrow wounds, such as the one suffered by Menelaus, carried a mortality rate of 42%. Slingshot wounds carried a mortality rate of 67%, spear wounds 80%, and sword wounds 100%. Now, these aren't hard data since Greek gods are getting involved, and Achilles has sort of an unfair combat advantage being a demigod. But if we're to glean some sense of historical accuracy out of this data, what the high mortality rate suggests is that surgeons are unable to get to wounded soldiers during combat and are only able to treat high class or those who survived after the battle ended. Surgeons weren't able to get to soldiers during what was called by later combat medics the golden hour, the principle that a victim's chances of survival are greatest if he receives resuscitation within the first hour after a severe injury. In the American Revolution, the Continental Congress authorized one surgeon to serve in each regiment, but there were only 2 medical schools in the United States, and few of the regimental surgeons were trained. And if they did, they had little experience treating trauma. There was little organization, and regimental surgeons had to work for their unit instead of seeing themselves as part of the hospital department. A major step forward happens in the Napoleonic Wars. Baron Dominique Jean Léry was regarded as the originator of modern military trauma, and what would be known as triage. He put surgical teams near the front lines to shorten the elapsed time after injury and instituted special ambulances or horse-drawn in which the wounded would ride on, what we could understand as early versions of EMT, of emergency medical technicians. The most badly wounded were first taken care of without regard to the patient's chances of survival or need to restore less gravely wounded soldiers to the front line quickly. Access to care and immediate amputation reduced mortality rates. In the Crimean War, which was fought in the early 1850s, the importance of organized evacuation and surgical care close to the front line was re-emphasized. The French, who inherited the Napoleonic legacy, provided good battle care and had expert organization and light ambulances, whereas the British medical services didn't. Their services were quite poor. This is actually where Florence Nightingale enters the picture. Her and a staff of 38 volunteers served in the British barracks in Istanbul, Turkey, where her act was to scrub the hospital, provide clean bedding and ventilation and sewage disposal. This is before bacteriology is really understood all that well, and provide rigorous sanitary procedures. The army bureaucracy didn't like her, but mortality rates in the hospital plummeted. This inspired other reformers like Nikolai Pirogov, who served in the Imperial Russian Army and brought skilled nurses into military hospitals and worked to modernize medical equipment. Now there was no longer a monopoly on combat medicine with the physician, but it was part of this three-tiered system that I mentioned was fleshed out in the Civil War, where there are the combat medics, those who are closest to the field, and then MASH units, and then there are hospitals further away where more intensive and more complicated care can be given. At the beginning of the Civil War, the U.S. Army and Navy had about 100 physicians with almost no experience with battlefield trauma among them. The previous large military engagement in the United States was the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. Almost 30 of whom resigned to join the Confederacy, so this kicks the number down to 70. The medical department had no clear chain of command or control of supplies. The U.S. Army Quartermaster's Corps was responsible for supplying and provisioning troops, and also responsible for battlefield evacuation. This disorganization showed itself in the First Battle of Manassas in July 21st, 1861, or the First Battle of Bull Run. This was a major defeat for the Union forces, and soldiers fled back to Washington. Over 2,700 were killed or wounded, and the medical department couldn't handle the load. Because regimental surgeons worked for their unit only, they were either swamped with casualties or had nothing to do. Regimental band members and civilian ambulance drivers hired by the Quartermaster's Corps fled from the battle. Most of the wounded had to walk 27 miles from the battlefield to Washington to reach the hospitals in the rear. Those who couldn't walk remained on the battlefield for days until they were picked up by ambulances, or captured by Confederate forces, or died from infection or bleeding. So the Union Army realized it quickly had to reorganize. Part of the challenge is that the Civil War was unlike anything America had fought in memory of almost all the troops involved. In the decades before the war, American military action mostly consisted of skirmishes with Native Americans in the frontier, and the few wounded were treated at the various forts in small infirmaries. You'd be dealing with a few soldiers who were injured in a skirmish, or at most a few dozen. In cities, hospitals were for the working classes and had very poor reputations. You would be personally treated by a physician if you had the means. It wasn't really until the last decade of the 19th century where, thanks to reforms of people like Florence Nightingale, where hygiene was emphasized, that hospitals were looked upon as a place where you go to be healed, not some sort of charitable institution for the very poor where you would more likely than not get an infection. Another challenge in the Civil War is that hospitals weren't equipped for the new types of devastation that happened in that war. This was due to the Minié ball bullets and the rifle cannon, which tore through soldiers in a way that other types of artillery hadn't. And as I mentioned in a series on key battles of the Civil War with co-host James Early, in the Civil War, militaries were still using Napoleon-era style tactics, which was fine when muskets were only accurate to a few dozen yards. But when rifled bullets were accurate to a much larger distance, soldiers were killed in absolutely catastrophic numbers. The first major land battle of Bull Run that was fought on July 16, 1861, there were two unproven armies that met each other and slaughtered each other. Like I said, the North suffered 2,700 casualties, the South 1,900, and soldiers had to walk as far as 3 days to get back home. And the casualties only grew as the war went on. There were 22,000 casualties in Antietam, 23,000 at Shiloh, 30,000 at Spotsylvania, 36,000 at Chickamauga, and 51,000 at Gettysburg. So change needed to happen. And it happened under the leadership of Surgeon General Alexander Hammond, who appointed Jonathan Letterman as medical director. He created the ambulance and hospital system that I talked about earlier. Letterman was known as the father of modern battlefield medicine, and his work saved thousands of soldiers from dying horrible deaths on the battlefield.